Following the Civil War in 1865, the United States entered one of the most important and contested periods in its history. Known as Reconstruction, this era forced a nation to answer a difficult question: how do you rebuild a country that had been divided by war and redefine freedom at the same time? At the center of Reconstruction were several urgent issues, not the least of which included seeking answers to the following questions. What should be done with the former Confederate states? Under what conditions should they return to the Union? What rights should be granted to formerly enslaved people? And just who would take responsibility for rebuilding the South's economy? Americans were deeply divided. Some believed the South should be quickly forgiven in order to restore national unity. Others argued that the South needed to be fundamentally transformed before it could rejoin the nation. Three major groups shaped this period. Political leaders in Washington, including on one side Southern Democratic President Andrew Johnson, and leading Republicans in Congress debated policy. Southern whites worked to maintain social and economic control, and formerly enslaved African Americans sought to define freedom on their own terms. But for more than 4 million free people, freedom meant land, political rights, the right to establish families on their own terms, and the right to obtain an education, something that was fundamentally denied to them in slavery. Now, Reconstruction unfolded in two phases. Presidential Reconstruction, led by Andrew Johnson, took a more lenient approach. Congressional Reconstruction, also known as military Reconstruction, imposed stricter federal control to enforce change. One important effort was the Freedmen's Bureau, which provided education, legal assistance, and limited support for land ownership. It represented an early attempt by the federal government to support formerly enslaved people. Congress also placed the South under military rule, dividing into districts governed by Union generals to enforce new laws and protect civil rights. 3 constitutional amendments reshaped the nation. First, there was the 13th Amendment, which is what actually ended legalized chattel slavery in the United States. Pay careful attention to the incarceration clause in the language. Next, there's the 14th Amendment, which goes by alternate names. It is known as the Natural-Born Citizenship Amendment and the Due Process Amendment. Read the language carefully to see why this is the case. Then finally we have the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote. These changes led to increased political participation, including the election of African American officials for the first time in U.S. history. Men like these shown here, who were among the first African American men to hold elected federal office. This is Jonathan C. Gibbs, a key figure in Florida's Reconstruction government. He served as Florida's Secretary of State and later as Superintendent of Public Instruction, where he played a central role in establishing and expanding the state's public education system, including advocating for schooling for formerly enslaved people. Gibbs was widely respected for his intellect, leadership, and commitment to civil rights. His work helped lay the foundation for public education in Florida during a transformative period in American history. He died in 1874 while still in office, leaving behind a legacy of service and advancement for African Americans in the post-Civil War South. At the same time, institutions like the Black Church became central to community life, providing leadership, education, and a space for organizing. Tallahassee's Bethel AME exemplifies this dynamic. Founded in 1865, Bethel's membership included some of Florida's and Tallahassee's leading Reconstruction figures, and throughout its history has remained an important institution in organizing for black community. However, economic independence remained limited. Many African Americans became sharecroppers, trapped in cycles of debt that restricted opportunity, as this diagram illustrates. As progress was made, resistance grew. Southern whites pushed back against Reconstruction policies, often violently. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan used intimidation and terror to suppress black political participation. Reconstruction came to an end in 1877 when federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Without federal protection, many of the gains made during this period began to disappear. As this cartoon and its title proclaiming this to be a white man's government illustrate, black hopes for equal treatment under the law, continued progress, and economic security were crushed by a status quo ready to move on from the Civil War and from the challenges facing newly emancipated black people. In the wake of Reconstruction, the idea of a New South promoted industrial growth and modernization. While some cities developed, many systems of inequality remained in place. Some of the leaders of this movement included men pictured here. Georgia's Henry Grady is considered the father of the New South movement and one of its chief advocates. James Duke was a North Carolina industrialized whose American Tobacco Company controlled over 90% of America's tobacco production at the turn of the 20th century. Asa Chandler founded iconic American company Coca-Cola, basing its operations out of Atlanta. Practices like convict leasing recreated forced labor conditions, disproportionately affecting black men. This dynamic was made possible by the incarceration clause in the 13th Amendment. By the late 19th century, Jim Crow laws institutionalized segregation. The Supreme Court's 1896 decision in Plessy v. Ferguson established the doctrine of separate but equal, reinforcing racial inequality. Jim Crow laws took their name from a 19th century minstrel show character named Jim Crow. The name was used to describe sets of de jure or by law racial separation policies that were a way of life in the American South for nearly a century. Influential African Americans offered thoughts on what they believed were the best approaches to navigating the challenging realities of the post-Reconstruction era. Booker T. Washington and Dr. W.B. Du Bois were two such men. Washington, born enslaved, was a founder of Tuskegee Institute, and Dr. Du Bois, born in Massachusetts, was the first black man to obtain a Ph.D. from Harvard. Booker T. Washington emphasized economic advancement and self-help, while W.B. Du Bois argued for immediate civil rights and higher education. But both approaches contributed to the long struggle for equality. Reconstruction left a lasting legacy. It established constitutional protections that would later support the civil rights movement, but it also allowed systems of inequality to take hold for generations. Even today, we are still grappling with the unfinished work of Reconstruction.